I would like to welcome you to our third and last day of our online conference. Welcome to new people, and we also recognize some people who have been with us every day. So welcome to all of you. We've been over the past 2 days now discussing the questions that a future Nexus assessment of IPBES could address. And we have been focusing on linkages between water, food and health, biodiversity and climate change, thinking about how the Sustainable Development Goals related to all of these 5 topics could be reached simultaneously, and the type of issues and questions that a future IPBES assessment could focus upon. So on day 1, we first had a bit of a presentation on IPBES itself, on the achievements of the first work program, particularly some of the outcomes of the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and a bit of a presentation of the new work program up to 2030, in particular the 3 new topics, the Nexus being one of these new topics. We then heard from our first speaker, who was focusing on water, Dr. Lutando Nziba, and we then had a discussion of about 2 hours, including his presentation, on all of the linkages related to water. And after that, we opened a forum inviting written contributions, again on these same topics, asking people to write the question with a bit of rationale, which then we are collecting. Yesterday we did the exact same thing, but for health. And today we will do the same on food. Yesterday, our speaker was Peter Dasak, who is the president of the Eco Health Alliance. Before I present Ana Paula Aguiar, our speaker for today, I will just show one slide. Apologies for those who have been with us since the beginning of the week. This is the 3rd time you see that slide, I'm afraid. And this really is only to explain where we are at the process towards this Nexus assessment of IPBES. So we are at the very beginning of the process. As you can see, we call this a pre-scoping conference, and our purpose today is to collect input from all of you regarding questions that this future Nexus assessment would address, and all of your contributions, including your written contribution to the forum, would then be collated, summarized, and be given to people who are going to be selected and attend a scoping meeting next year. The call is still open. You still have a chance to apply and be nominated, deadline being the 15th of October. And this group of people, the scoping expert, would produce a roadmap for this Nexus assessment, outlining the chapters that the future assessment could contain, together with a series of bullet points on what each one of these chapters would address. And it's based on that scoping report that IPBES 8 would then approve and decide to go for the assessment itself, at which point there would be a call for experts to produce the assessment, and a 3 to 4 year process to produce the actual report. So as you can see, this is really the beginning of a long journey. And it's now my pleasure to come to our topic for today, which is food and linkages. And I would like to introduce Dr. Ana Paula Aguiar. Ana Paula is currently at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and she's actually working on a project which is at the core of our preoccupations, since she's looking at measures to achieve all of these sustainable development goals simultaneously. She is also a senior researcher at the Brazilian Institute for Space Research, INPE, and her background is in the use of models and scenarios, particularly in the context of land use change. And Ana Paula is quite familiar with IPBES since she has been a lead author for Chapter 5 of the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Chapter 5 dealing with pathways towards a sustainable future. And you are now also going to be associated to the task force on scenarios and models. So with that, I will hand over to you and invite you to make your introduction to this topic of food and linkages. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, okay. So I am presenting an overview about key Nexus issues related to food. It's not supposed to be cover everything, but I try to provide some insights to be further developed by you. And I will use the results of Chapter 5. As Annie said, I was a lead author in this chapter about pathways towards sustainable future. And we developed in the chapter an approach based on Nexus Thinking to try to derive information about how to attain multiple goals based on scenario literature. So we used this, we selected some focal issues to be able to organize the information and present it. And as you can see here in this landscape, food was a central issue on two of our focus issues, one related to fisheries, marine ecosystem, the other one about land. But all these focal issues, they are interlinked, one in the landscape. For instance, there was one related to mitigation options, to urban areas, to conservation and restoring, and to fresh water. And I'm also showing this. I'm going to use some of the framing, and the way we did this was all about like framing each one of these issues, and then discussing these pathways to achieve those goals, using this as a kind of a lens. But also, the idea is that we zoom in one of these focal issues, and then zoom out, always thinking about the interlinkages, and that's kind of the approach I'm going to use today. So I'm going to go link by link with examples. But also relating all the links to each other. And organizing the presentation in three parts. The first part, we are going to focus more on the food production issues, problems and pathways. The second part is about more about indirect drivers, especially consumption. And in the third part, a little bit of a synthesis and some examples of policy relevant questions for this future assessment, just examples. So starting with part one, and I'm going to organize, first I'm going to talk about agriculture, then about fisheries. I'm going to focus on these, and also showing how they are related. So about agriculture expansion is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss through deforestation and the conversion for agriculture for pastures and agriculture, and this is a direct driver of biodiversity loss by itself. And then when I'm also going to use this to show how we were building these pathways, this information about pathways using this Nexus Thinking. So when you think about deforestation and about this problem of agricultural expansion, the pathway elements are, of course, to halt deforestation, to promote the restoration of degraded ecosystems, to improve the network of protected areas, to promote agricultural intensification, to produce more food in less area, decrease consumption and waste pressure, for example. But then at the same time, this thing about agriculture intensification, it has implications in the nexus. It has implications in the nexus as the use of pesticides, for instance, and it is also a driver of biodiversity loss and of health issues, directly and also indirectly through the water. And then this is really a critical issue, and I'm showing here the little figure here. This is really a critical issue that addresses also water and health through water pollution, contamination of what we eat and what we drink. And this also is not a local problem, then it affects the cities and of course with different socioeconomic conditions and etc. So the thing about adding to this pathway discussion is a central issue of modernizing agriculture to produce without harming biodiversity, water quality and health. And then there are many pathways being discussed related to the current agricultural, there are many different types of agricultural systems, but to the current agricultural, industrial agriculture, are more related to agroecological intensification or regenerative agriculture and several things. And also another link here is about also irrigation. So agriculture, especially more intensive agriculture, is going to use water for irrigation, is a major user of water, and it's going to compete with other uses, and I suppose that this was discussed in the other day, with other uses for energy, for drinking water, for industry, etc. What also links to the energy nexus and link, because then you also have this question about the problems about dams and energy and the hydropower and the effect that it has on biodiversity itself. So it's just like flying around. I'm just flying around all the linkages and nexus. And then we talking about the climate change and agriculture. You have, of course, when you deforest and you have direct emissions from forest conversion, from land use change, and from agriculture itself. But there are also other linkages, important linkages, there are between climate change and food production through the land-based mitigation options. So this is a figure, is a schematic figure about the solutions being proposed in the current global scenarios related to 1.5 degrees, the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. And when you see the solutions being discussed, they include these land mitigation options. And the results are like an increased area of biofuels and large areas under restoration of afforestation or reforestation, which you compete even more with the area available for food production, which you require even more intensive production of food. And what these scenarios also, and then link it to the previous slide, and what these current scenarios also have in their assumptions are that very low population in comparison to the other scenarios where the 1.5 degrees is not reached, and change in diets and less weight, etc. So this also, this part here controls a bit of the demand, so balance a little bit for the availability of the need for area. So we are going to come back to just demand issues in a moment. But also there is another link to climate change that is through two things. One is also related to irrigation that we were talking about, because it might affect water availability and their ability to actually use irrigation in certain areas. And it might also affect crop productivity, although not the same in everywhere, but it might affect. So, and this is a very simple attempt to do some causal loop diagram of how all this is related. Well, about fisheries. Well, let me see here on my notes. Fisheries and aquaculture are a very important source of food. I think that the number is that today, nowadays, it corresponds to provides 70% of all the animal protein that people use. But and the demand is supposed to grow, especially and in fact the aquaculture production has been increasing in the last years, decades. But although the fisheries have reached a limit, so aquaculture aquaculture solves some of the problems about the fish stocks, but creates other problems in coastal zones of pollution, etc. So it's a very good example of a decision that needs to be made, and when we discuss pathway elements related to these, they address like conserving or restoring marine ecosystems, rebuilding these overfish stocks, and then you have this short-term versus long-term trade-off of maybe during this process you end up having to decide on affecting some livelihoods that depend on these fish stocks. There is also marine protected areas, halting illegal activities, and the social participation of community to discuss this. And of course, improve the aquaculture practices. And also finally, in relation to climate change, it will affect the oceans in several ways, acidification and sea level rise, but also the fish stocks. So it's important to mitigate climate change. This will maybe reduce the impacts of all these trade-offs that we have been discussing. But the other thing about that's not related to climate change, but it's important in this nexus, is really the issue of pollution. Both the pollution that comes from agriculture and from land, and also this thing about plastic pollutions, that's a big issue. And this is all also related to as I said before, for instance, to the hydropower and energy components of the Nexus. So then the other part related to food consumption, all the things that we were talking about here till now were more related to the production side, but also there are aspects to be considered in the whole supply chain to the consumers, and also related to just indirect drivers. One very important part that has been discussed in several recent reports and publications is about the changes in diets and how different diets may contribute to minimize all these problems. And of course, this involves also behavior change and several other changes. Another aspect of this is actually, as I mentioned before, population, the population growth, population, urbanization trends, and how all of this is going to affect. As I said, in this 1.5 degree scenarios, they are working with very low population growth in relation to the other scenarios, and the other aspect is the trade. So today the food production is globalized, and you have countries that produce, consider part of the food that other countries consume. And these telecouplings are important to be addressed too. So this was a very brief covering the several of these linkages, and then going to the last part. What I think that's important in this whole thing is that when we discuss and we come to this new assessment, we find a way of addressing each issue, but then also going back and addressing how they are interlinked. And the other thing is very important that we very clear state where the main options and the decisions that need to be done are. So we might have several different pathways to the same goals, and we cannot disregard the power structures and the struggles there, and the winners and losers when deciding about just different pathways. So by examples of policy relevance questions for the assessment, I put 3 examples here. So which are the options for food production in different socioeconomic contexts, and how they affect biodiversity, climate change, and health, and how this option affect the involved actors, farmers, small farmers, fishermen, large corporations, etc. I think that the land-based mitigation is a crucial issue also to be discussed. And which are the land-based mitigation options in different socioeconomic contexts, which are their implications, and how do they compare to other mitigation options, alternative energy sources, etc. And the third block would be this thing about options for alternative diets, also in different socioeconomic contexts, how they affect biodiversity, climate change, and also the global food trade, which are the options. Just examples, just for ideas for discussion. Okay, thank you. That was my introduction. Thank you for your attention.